someone killed a man. Then they did something that makes this case almost impossible to understand. They removed the parts of his body that could have helped identify him. They took away his head. They took away his hands. And then someone dressed him, not in his own clothes, in clothes that belonged to somebody else. They rolled his remains up, took him into quiet woodland in southern England, and left him there. More than 3 decades later, police still cannot answer the most basic question in the entire investigation. Who was this man? And perhaps even more disturbing, why did somebody work so hard to make sure nobody would ever know? The story begins in October of 1991. Bolney is a small village in West Sussex. Quiet roads, woodland, fields. The kind of place where something unusual would stand out immediately. On the 11th of October, human remains were discovered in undergrowth near Broxmead Lane. What police were dealing with quickly became clear. This was not simply an unidentified person who had died alone. Investigators believed the man had been murdered. His head was gone. His hands were gone. There was no wallet providing an easy answer. No name that detectives could immediately connect to a missing person report. Nothing that simply told investigators, this is him. The killer had left police with a body, but without an identity. And that created an enormous problem. Normally, when detectives investigate a murder, they begin with the victim. Who knew them? Where did they live? Where'd they work? Who had they spoken to? Who had a reason to hurt them? Who saw them last? But here, police could not even begin with the first question. They did not know his name. All they had were the physical clues that remained. He was a white man. Investigators noted a small star-shaped mole on his right thigh. He had a protruding stomach. Years later, improved forensic examination would place his age at somewhere between around 30 and 40 years old. His height was estimated at roughly 5'6" to 5'8". Those details should have helped. Someone, somewhere, should have been missing a man matching that description. A brother, a son, a friend, a co-worker, a neighbor. But no identification came. And then investigators discovered something about his clothing. Something that transformed an already disturbing murder into something far stranger. The shirt and trousers found on the body were not his. Police determined that the man had been dressed after he died. Think about what that means. Someone did not simply kill this man and leave him. After his death, somebody spent time changing how he looked. They put different clothes onto his body. Why? Were his original clothes identifiable? Did they contain something that could reveal where he worked? A uniform? A label? Something in a pocket? Were the replacement clothes intended to confuse investigators? Or was there another reason nobody has ever understood? Police knew what had happened. They knew the clothing did not belong to the victim, but they still did not know who he was. Years passed. The unidentified man was eventually buried in Haywards Heath. His grave could not carry the name he had used during his life, because nobody knew it. He was simply an unknown male. But investigators did not completely forget him. As forensic science improved, detectives realized that the man himself could still contain information that investigators in 1991 had been unable to recover. In 2009, his remains were exhumed. The hope was simple. Technology had changed. Perhaps the dead man could finally tell police something about where he came from. A full genetic profile was obtained. His age estimate was reconsidered. His height was studied. And scientists examined chemical information preserved inside his remains. Then came one of the biggest breakthroughs the investigation had ever produced. This man apparently had a connection to Bavaria in southern Germany. Suddenly, the mystery was much larger than one quiet village in England. Police had discovered a man in Woodland in West Sussex. But forensic evidence pointed toward Germany. Investigators traveled to Germany seeking answers. They appealed for information. They tried to find somebody who recognized the unknown victim. But still, no name, no family, no confirmed history. Nothing that could finally tell police who had been abandoned in those woods. And there was another detail, one that sounds as though it belongs in a crime novel. Not far from where the unidentified man had been found was a house that had been rented by a German fraudster. The distance was only around a mile. Police investigated that connection. It was an obvious lead. An unidentified victim with forensic links to Germany. A German fraudster living nearby. The timing. The location. Investigators had to examine it. But this is where the facts matter. Police never established evidence linking that man to the murder. He was investigated. The theory received considerable attention, but investigators did not prove that he killed the unidentified victim. And that distinction is important, because the Bolney case became filled with theories. Organized criminals. People arriving from Germany. Connections created after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Various possibilities were examined, but theories could not solve the central problem. Before police could understand why this man was murdered, they needed to know who he was. And nobody could give them that answer. That is what makes this case so unsettling. Imagine how difficult it is to completely erase somebody. Most people leave traces everywhere. Photographs, documents, medical records, school records, employment records, friends, neighbors, family, people who remember their voice, people who remember their face, somebody who notices when they stop calling, somebody who eventually asks, "Where did he go?" Yet this man ended up in English woodland, without his head, without his hands, wearing somebody else's clothes, and nobody successfully identified him. There's also something unusual about the way the body was found. The location was quiet enough that one of the original investigators later described the discovery as remarkably fortunate. There were no nearby houses providing an obvious witness. No constant stream of traffic. Whoever chose that location had placed the victim somewhere that could have remained unnoticed. But the body was found. And because it was found, somebody had a chance to give this man his name back. More than 30 years later, that still has not happened. And the clothing remains one of the details I keep coming back to. Because removing identifying body parts already tells investigators something. Whoever was responsible apparently did not want identification to be easy. But dressing the victim after death adds another layer. Someone had clothes available. Someone made the decision to use them. Someone physically changed the way the victim would be discovered. And according to investigators, those clothes belonged to somebody else. That raises questions that have never received satisfying answers. Where were the victim's actual clothes? Why were they removed? Whose clothes replaced them? Was their owner involved in the crime? Were they simply clothing that could not be traced? Was somebody trying to make the victim look like a completely different person? Or was the explanation something detectives never considered? Then there is Germany. Modern forensic science did something the original investigation could not. It found geographical information hidden inside a man who could no longer speak. A connection to Bavaria. Detectives traveled there more than once. Yet even with that information, even after international appeals. Nobody gave investigators the answer they needed. There is a strange contradiction at the center of this case. Somebody appears to have gone to considerable effort to hide this man's identity. But whoever he was, there should still have been people somewhere who knew him. Somewhere in Germany, England, or another part of Europe, there could have been a photograph, a missing person report, a family story about someone who disappeared, an old friend who wondered where he went. Perhaps somebody knew exactly what happened. Perhaps somebody knew part of the story without ever realizing that the unidentified man found in Bolney was the person they remembered. Or perhaps the person responsible understood the victim's life well enough to know that nobody would immediately come searching. We do not know. And that is where speculation has to stop. Because after decades of theories, investigations, and advances in forensic science, the verified mystery remains extraordinary enough without inventing anything. A man was murdered. His head and hands were removed. He was dressed after death in clothes that were not his. His remains were left in Woodland in West Sussex. Years later, forensic analysis connected him to Bavaria. Police investigated several possible leads, including the nearby presence of a German fraudster, but no evidence established that man's involvement in the murder. The victim remained unidentified. His killer remained unidentified. His real story remained unknown. Somewhere behind the label given to this case was an actual person. He had a name. He had a childhood. He spoke to people. He walked through streets somewhere. He had memories that belonged only to him. And then, in October of 1991, he became known to the world not by his name, but by the place where his remains were discovered. The Bolney torso. That is not who he was. That is simply what happened to him. And more than 3 decades later, that difference matters. Because solving this case does not begin with discovering the killer. It begins with discovering the victim. Who was the man in the woods? Why was he in England? Why did forensic evidence point towards southern Germany? Why was he dressed in somebody else's clothes after his death? And who went to such extraordinary lengths to make sure his name disappeared with him? Until somebody answers that first question. A gravestone in England represents a man whose entire identity is still missing. And somewhere in the past, someone may have known exactly who he was,